We're studying the life of Joseph, and we've been looking at his life, and I want to draw your attention to two dreams that he's had. The two dreams were made very early in this story, and the first one was about the sheaves of grain bowing before him, and that represented his brothers, and that was fulfilled in chapter 42 when his 10 brothers first came down to Egypt. Joseph's second dream, though, was about the 11 stars, the sun and the moon bowing to him. And we saw on the second trip of his brothers, when 11 of them came down in Genesis 43, that was partially fulfilled. But we were waiting for that full fulfillment where the moon and the sun would bow. And in chapter 47, in 46 and 47, we saw implicitly that Jacob and the 11 brothers bowed down. And that was implicitly in that they came down to Egypt and they came under his rule. Just a side note here, Leah. We learn later on in chapter 49 and 50 that Leah had died, and she's buried in Canaan. And it's hard to know whether she has been buried before they took the move down to Egypt, or while they're in Egypt, she died, and then they brought her back. But in either case, she's there, and explicitly here at the end of chapter 47, we saw Jacob, who is a representative of the whole family, bowing down. So she'd be included there at least, if not if she was still alive and moved to Egypt. So after 47, we see 48 and 49 will cover a larger section that talks about the preparations of Jacob's passing. And specifically, it's going to apply to Joseph and to the rest of the brothers. And at the end of 47, this topic has been introduced. Because at the very end, we saw the preparations of the future. Chapter 47, verses 28 through 31, where Jacob is making Joseph solemnly swear that he won't bury him in Egypt, but that he will go to his family tomb that is right outside of Hebron in Machpelah. And there's extremely important to Jacob because being buried there with the rest of his family and his wife, that connects them and the ancestors to that land. That is where they belong. That's their land and not in Egypt. And so chapter 48 approaches the same topic of preparing for his death, his coming death, but it approaches it from a different perspective. So in chapter 48, we read about Jacob bestowing blessings on Joseph. And in this scene, this is a private meeting between Joseph, Jacob, and Joseph's two sons. And in that scene, we see Jacob communicating two messages of blessing on Joseph in preparation of his death. The first message is that Jacob conveys Joseph's place in the covenant promises of God, verses 1 through 7. And it begins in the first two verses with the occasion for the visit. The text says, "Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, 'Behold, your father is sick.' So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. When it was told to Jacob, 'Behold, your son Joseph has come to you,' Israel collected his strength and sat up in his bed." So notice it says, "Now it came about after these things." These things refer to the previous scene where Jacob is asking Joseph to swear that he would bury him in Canaan and not in Egypt. So Jacob knows that his end is near, that he's coming to the end of his life. And so this scene here, he's sick. And when he's sick, he is around 147. It's possibly that it's slightly more, but according to the context, and my best understanding of it is that this scene is literally days away from his death. So that would make him 147. And at 147, if you're sick, well, there's a good chance that that's going to be the end. So Joseph takes his two sons, because this could be the very last opportunity that his sons are going to see their grandfather. So the next verses, 3 through 7, we see Jacob communicates his message to Joseph. And in the first 2 verses, he gives a recollection of God's covenant promises. Verses 3 reads, "Then Jacob said to Joseph, 'God Almighty appeared to me at Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession.'" Now, when he says Luz, he's referring to the old name of Bethel. Bethel is the name that Jacob gave this place, which is formerly known as Luz. And he did that because he had 2 visions from God at that place. So he said it must be where God's house is. And that's what Bethel means. Beth means house, El means God, the house of God. And you notice this is the very first thing that Jacob is saying to Joseph at the end of his life. He's recounting his experience and revelation that God had given him. And he identifies God as God Almighty. In Hebrew, that's El Shaddai, which conveys that God is a sovereign ruler and judge of all things, where he either brings judgment and death or life and blessing. And it focuses on his power, which is omnipotent, and his right to use it. And here, Jacob is communicating that God has chosen and decreed to bless his family and his family line. So it says, the God Almighty appeared to me. He appeared. That and alone is a blessing and a unique experience. Basically, Jacob had a heavenly experience. And he was never the same. He would never be the same. And this is kind of experience where Jacob was in touch with the spiritual realm. This was extremely rare. It only happened a few times in his lifetime, and it rarely happens to anyone. And this is a major event, and that's why he's communicating it. I had a moment where I received special revelation from heaven, and you need to be reminded of it. And he said that God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Now, when he talks about being blessed, a blessing is to give someone special graces. And God blessed him through these words and through this appearance, through this experience. And a blessing is the removal of sin and its effects from one's life. And it moves people towards a restored state of being. It's God's perfect state of being, which he intended from the beginning. We were intended and created to live an incredibly blessed life. Sin has perverted that and diminished that. So a blessing is being restored back to God's goodness and what he intended. So Jacob's recollection of blessing here, his blessing promises from God, summarize the revelation that he has experienced in Genesis chapter 28. And here in 48, he's focusing on 2 things. Number 1, the numerous descendants, and then the promise of land. And as you can see in chapter 28, we see the same 2 topics. We see the land here and the descendants here. And in chapter 28, this is when Jacob is fleeing from Esau. He has deceived his father to gain that blessing, the blessing of the firstborn. And as he's fleeing, he stops at Luz, which is now called Bethel, to sleep. And during that sleep, he had that vision, and he saw that ladder, that staircase in heaven, the angels ascending and descending, and that's where he's had that experience. And this is where God reveals to him that he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and conveys that blessing, the covenant blessing, to Jacob. So, although God communicates and promises more things, as you can see from the rest of the text that's not highlighted, Jacob focuses on the promise of many descendants and of land, which is important for the readers and for his time. So when Jacob returned to Canaan, after he stayed with Laban, after he got married and after he had his children, he was coming back from Padan Aram, and after the whole incident at Shechem, where the unfortunate incident happened with Dinah, and then Simeon and Judah destroy all the male inhabitants. Jacob, as he's going southward, he stops again at Luz. And there again, God appears to him and again makes that covenant promises. He reiterates it, reaffirms it. And again, we see the promise of the numerous descendants and a promise of the land. These things that he's saying now are representation of the blessings that were confirmed multiple times to Jacob. And if you notice at the end here, he says something that is not in the previous promises, which is, I'll give the land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now, an everlasting possession, that's actually words that were used specifically to Abraham in chapter 13, verse 15, and also chapter 17, verse 8. What that communicates is that he is viewing all the words and covenant promises made to Abraham and Isaac, they just completely transfer over to him, and he's moving them over to the rest of his descendants and his family. These promises are then applied to Joseph. And he communicates in the next two verses how Joseph is going to find his place within that covenant promise. So Jacob now adds and says, now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. But your offspring that have been born after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. So in these words, in these two verses, we see that Jacob adopts Ephraim and Manasseh as his own sons. And thus they're going to each receive an equal portion of the land and of the inheritance and of the blessings as all the rest of the sons are. And that's thus introducing Jacob's two sons into those promises of God. So in essence, Joseph, who is represented by his two sons, is actually receiving a double portion, because two of his sons will have an inheritance. And that's a great blessing and a great honor that's bestowed upon Joseph. Now notice he mentions they'll be mine as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Reuben and Simeon are the two oldest. So he's saying, your two oldest sons are going to be like my two oldest sons, and they're going to receive the eldest son's blessings. And notice the order here, it's switched. Earlier, it was Manasseh and Ephraim, and that's the normal order because Manasseh is older. But notice here, Jacob, when he says it, he says Ephraim and Manasseh. He puts the younger first. And that's going to be important in just a few more verses. So we'll hold off until we get there. In verse 6 he says, but your offspring that you have been born after them shall be yours. It suggests that Joseph has or will have other children in the land of Egypt. And probability is that he already has more children. And I'll explain why in just a little bit. But any of those other children that he has, they will be underneath the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. In verse 7, Jacob moves in a different direction, in an odd direction that is quite puzzling, where he he gives his recollection of Rachel's death in verse 7. Verse 7 says, Now as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died, to my sorrow, in the land of Canaan, on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. Now that story, that account is written for us in chapter 35. And notice there's a great contrast there between God has just blessed him and given the covenant blessings here in Bethel, and as he's going down, this is where Rachel dies. A few days later, Rachel dies. Traditionally, she died in Ramah, and I believe it says in other passages that that's where she had passed. So what does this communicate? You would think, God just gave me a heavenly vision telling me he's going to bless me and yet my favorite beloved wife dies. Does that sound like a blessing? There's a contrast there. It shows that God's blessings in this life, it doesn't remove all of the effects of sin in society. It doesn't mean we won't have any pain or suffering. All the effects of sin, pain and suffering, that will only be removed in the resurrection. So why is this a part of Jacob's message? Why is this so important to communicate? And notice here that Benjamin's birth is not listed. Rachel died shortly after giving birth to Benjamin. That was a major part of that story. And yet, the focus here is on the location of Rachel's burial. It's in the land of Canaan. So again, Joseph has a connection to that land. That's where his mother is buried. And so that is the place of his ancestors. They're all there. They're all buried there. So by way of summary, in his first message of blessing, Jacob needed to communicate clearly the promises that God had made to his family, both of land and of his descendants. And they needed to know God's revealed word. That was important. If you think about it this way, this is Jacob's last words. If you knew you only had days to live, what message would you give? This is what he's giving. This is the importance of what he's saying, the words and his thoughts. Number two, since God's promises were not fulfilled in Jacob's lifetime, their fulfillment was something that his descendants could expect to see and therefore live accordingly. Live out of faith in what God had promised. Number three, becoming the head of the family, Joseph needed to be reminded of these things so that he could make decisions for the family based on God's words, based on God's promises. And then number four, Joseph is connected to the land because his mother is buried there as well as his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and he promised his father that he would bury them there. And he has promised to bury his father there, so that makes his whole ancestry there, connected there. He's not making permanent roots in Egypt. So that is the first event where Jacob is communicating how Joseph is going to be connected with the covenant promises that were made to him, his father, and his grandfather, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The second part, the second message of this chapter communicates Jacob's blessing on Joseph, verses 8 through 22. In the first section, 8 through 11, we see Jacob's warm reception of Joseph's sons. Verse 8 and 9 says, Then Israel saw Joseph's sons, and he said, Who are these? And Joseph said to his father, They are my sons, whom God has given me here. So he said, Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Notice that Joseph, in answering his father, says, These are the sons whom God has given me. It communicates that he knows that life and children, they're a gift from God. They're precious. Life is precious, and it only comes from God. Children are unique beings that are placed into our care, and they're given to us as a blessing from God. And Joseph's words communicate that in his thankfulness and dependence on God for them and for their lives. So notice here that Joseph doesn't say their names. He just says, they're my sons, which implies that Jacob knows full well their names and who they are. So by the question that Jacob poses, who are these that are with you? And when he's asking Joseph to bring them closer, it seems that Jacob doesn't know or recognize them. How is that possible? There's three answers to that from the text. Number one, Joseph's sons are not young men. They're actually older. The sons were born to Joseph during the years of plenty. So by the end of the 7 years of plenty, they're anywhere from 1-year-olds to 6-year-olds. And remember, there's two of them, so there's 2 ages within that span. Then Jacob came down 2 to 3 years into the famine. So now we're at the 2 boys being between 3 and 9. And then Jacob lives 17 years in Egypt. So now the boys are somewhere between 20 and 26. So they're not boys anymore, are they? They're men. They're young men. And so being young men, there could be anyone. Number 2, verse 10 says, now the eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. So he couldn't see them clearly. And probably they're not right upon him. They're probably sitting in the distance as he's talking to Joseph. And then number 3, when Joseph was introduced, it says, now behold, your son Joseph has come. When they introduced the visitors, they never said anything about Ephraim or Manasseh. So here, when Israel finally realizes that there's someone behind him and he asks who these are, we can understand that he just couldn't see. He didn't expect them, so he didn't know that they were there. Their presence were not obvious. But when he learns of their presence, that his 2 grandsons are there, he wants to bless them. But first, what does he do? Then Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. There's a tenderness, an affection there, where the grandfather is physically expressing the great value and love for his grandsons. That is something that young men need. These are not little boys, these are young men. And yet he's embracing them and culturally giving them a kiss on the cheek and just physically expressing his affection for them. And the world will teach us and teach men that they need to be tough, macho. They don't need any of that, and they're independent. But that's not the biblical model. These grandsons who are at the age of 20, 26, they're a part of the family, and they're beloved, and they need to be accepted as part of the group and valued. And these actions demonstrate a warm reception. In our society, in our culture, and what the world kind of promotes is that elderly men, when they look at the young generation, they see waste, and they look down upon them, and they say foolishness and worthlessness. That is an easy way to reject people and to not fulfill the requirements and responsibilities that you have as an older generation to teach, to invest, to love, to embrace, or incorporate. Young men and women, they need community. And if they're not going to get it from the family, they're going to look outside. They're going to look somewhere else. So, the older generations should be modeling and investing in valuing the younger because they are the family that are coming up. They will bear your name, and you want them to follow Christ. So with the men near to him, Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well. We see a sense of joy in his words. Jacob still finds joy in the fact that Joseph is actually alive. This is 17 years later. And even more so that he has grandsons. And having grandsons, that alone is a symbol of God's blessing on Joseph. And isn't it true that when our children or grandchildren, when good things happen to them, that brings us great joy? And that's what's happening here. And notice he says, God has let me see. Jacob doesn't take that for granted. He acknowledges God is sovereign in the circumstances of his life. And that time that he has is a divine gift. That God has let him be reunited and is granting him days to enjoy Joseph and Joseph's sons, his grandsons. He is counting his blessings. You know, there's a saying that you don't know the value and the worth of something until it's taken away. Well, Joseph was taken away, and so we thought, but then it was restored. And it shows here that Jacob never again took that for granted. He valued every day. And Joseph and his grandsons, that relationship, that life together, produced joy in him. He didn't take that for granted. And notice there's an irony in the text, in the words, where it said, now his eyes of Israel were so dim from age that he could not see. And yet it says, when Israel saw Joseph, and then here Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see you. And behold, God has let me to see your children. Now in these latter two sections here, he's not talking about primarily physical sight. He's talking about the relationship. I never expected to see you again, to have this relationship with you again, nor let alone having grandchildren. The relationships, the time together, that's what's emphasized. That's what's being emphasized being important. Life together. And that is a gift. That is a blessing from God. How many relationships do you have? The life of other people. Those are gifts. Those are gifts from God. So after this reception, then we read of Jacob blessing Joseph through his sons. Verses 12 through 20. In the first part of that, we see Jacob positions to give the younger the firstborn blessing. So reading 12 through 14, it says, then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, although Manasseh was the firstborn. So we see the scene here of Joseph rearranging the boys. When it says they took him from his knees, they weren't sitting on his knees. They were up close to his grandfather. You can almost picture that his grandfather had his arms around them while he was sitting on his bed, just having that embrace and just having the physical contact. And so Joseph has taken the boys and now faced the boys to their grandfather and positioned them in such a way where when Jacob would put out his right hand, it would be on top of Manasseh, and his left hand and Ephraim. Now, why the right hand? The right hand in Scripture and in that culture and context, it always signifies strength and honor. And so the right hand would symbolically bestow a greater blessing than the left hand would. And that's why the older is supposed to be there. But now notice, where's Joseph's eyes? The text says that Joseph bowed his face to the ground before his father. So he positioned the sons, and then he bows. So he doesn't see that his father did a switch on him and crossed his hands. So in crossing the hands, he's about to bless the younger with the older's blessing. And this is a pattern that's happening throughout the patriarchs, where the younger is receiving the blessing of the older. We saw it with Isaac, and we saw it with Jacob himself. And so, with that scene about to happen, with the hands crossed and Joseph's face to the ground, then we see and read about Jacob's blessing started. Verses 15 through 16. And it says, he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. And may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So notice the text says he blessed Joseph. And yet when the blessing happens, it says bless the lads. It's because these two boys represent Joseph. collectively. In blessing the sons, he is blessing Joseph. And notice at the beginning, verse 15 and part of 16, Jacob begins his blessing by identifying the God that he has served in practical terms, how God has affected his life. The first line, it says, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. Walked, remember, is a metaphor for the journey of life, your behavior, your life's conduct, how you lived. It emphasizes a relationship between these men and God. A relationship in faith, in love, in obedience, and in worship. And how does Jacob know this? Because they have given testimony. They have shared it. They have communicated that with him. In line 2, it says, and the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. All my life. This is a personal testimony of Jacob's relationship with God, how God has affected him, and how he's guided him. He calls him my shepherd. Now, in ancient terms, in ancient culture, that is a metaphor for king. Someone who rules over. And rules over to take care of, to feed, to guide, to protect, to value, and to rule. So Jacob has followed him as a dependent sheep. And notice it says, to this day, he still does. This is a place where he will continue till his dying breath. And then in the first line of 16, it says, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. This is referring to God's manifest representation in an angel whom God has sent, who intervenes in human history with Jacob. God, when he appears, when it talks about the angel of the Lord, in these cases, it's referring to an actual angel whom God sends to interact. And in that culture, a representative that's sent by God speaks for God and actually is called God. He has a full authority for God as his representation, representative. Similar to an apostle. So here it says, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. Has redeemed me, has delivered me, has kept me from evil. Jacob is fully aware of an angelic presence that God has sent to protect him. And he was saved. That angel has protected him from Laban, the cruel intentions and of his uncle Laban to trick him and to use him. He's protected him from harm from Esau, and he's protected him from the other people in the land of Canaan, whom he was afraid would join together and attack him. So what we see here is a personal testimony of God who has worked in his life, in the life of his father, and the life of his grandfather. We see Jacob talking and blessing his grandsons and telling them about that personally. Do we see that happening today? Do we do that? Is that a priority to talk about our relationship with God and what he has done with us, for us, and in us, with our kids? Remember, this is the last words of his life, showing the great importance. That's the first section. And then the second section, we see the blessing. The general blessing that he gives. Remember, the blessing is God's divine favor and grace that's bestowed upon them. And first, and he says, bless the lads. May they receive your graciousness. And then he gives specifics. And may my name live on in them. And the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac. Now, what he's asking here is that they would identify their lives with his, with Isaac's, and with Abraham. Now, why those three, and what would that do to identify with their lives? It's not referring to the men alone. It's referring to the men and their walk, their identity as the children of God, as being in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. in scriptures all over the place, you'll see the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's how you identify with the covenants of God and the God who identified himself as Yahweh. And that's what he's saying here. May my name live on in you, in that you have a relationship, you continue this covenant relationship that I have with the God of the universe. And then he says, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. So he's asking again for God's blessing in the descendants. There'll be numerous. This word for multiply there is only used here in the Hebrew Bible, and it actually has a connotation of multiplying like fish, like a big school of fish, something that can't be counted. And here, when it says, and may they grow in the multitude in the midst of the earth, that's referring to the covenant promises that were made to him and his father and his grandfather. May they have that as well. And the multiplication of children, what does it imply about their conditions, about their life, their situations? It implies provision and it implies protection. In good times and in peaceful circumstances, that'll happen. So here we see Jacob is praying to God to carry over the covenant blessings and promises that were made to a particular family that he has enjoyed. He's praying that they carry over into his grandsons. And this blessing is irrevocable. This is something that happens at the end, which he won't take back. And it is a wonderful and powerful confirmation of God's covenant love at the end of his own life. He's experienced the greatest relationship, and he wants his children and grandchildren to continue that. And he's giving the boys an experience which they will not forget. In the next two verses, Joseph must have raised his eyes, because we see Jacob corrects Joseph's correction. The text says, and Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on Ephraim's head, and it displeased him. And he grasps his father's hand and to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also will become a people, and he also will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So sometime while that Jacob is giving that blessing, in the midst of that, Joseph raises his head and sees that the hands are crossed. And what does he think? His father is half blind. He thinks he just made a mistake. And he works quickly to correct it. And when he says that he was displeased, the Hebrew there is very strong. It says it was evil in his eyes, saying a great mishap has happened. This is not so. His eldest is being cheated. But in being corrected by Joseph, Jacob confirms, I know. He's emphasizing. And he knows that the younger is going to actually be greater. How? How does he know this? Prophecy. He's received a prophecy. Later in the scriptures and in extra-biblical writings, it's all viewed as being a prophecy given to Jacob about the future of his sons and grandsons. And that was given by God. So thus, by doing this, which is completely countercultural, because the eldest is supposed to receive the blessing, it shows that Jacob is having great faith. That what God had revealed to him, because God revealed it, that's what was going to happen. And the point there is that God's gracious blessing was not bestowed based on tradition or on natural status in the world, but solely it's based on his grace. Why did God bless the younger more than the elder? It's his choosing. It's his grace. And Jacob has just testified that God has been his shepherd all of his life, even to this very day. It shows that he's going to follow him. If God communicated this, he's going to continue in that way. And notice that it says that Manasseh is going to be great. It's going to be a huge people. But Ephraim, his brother, will be greater than he is. And his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. That word multitude is actually fullness. a fullness of nations, meaning they're going to be a people so large that they would make up their own nation. And it's implicit that they would have their own king like a nation. The multitude of nations, that's similar language that was used to Abraham. It would be a great number. And eventually, the northern kingdom of Israel is simply called Ephraim in many places, because the number of Ephraimites are the majority of the kingdom. So after making that correction, Jacob then continues, and Jacob finishes the blessing in verse 20, where he says, he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. So when it says, by you Israel will, he's acknowledging that descendants will continue and they'll become a nation, an actual nation. And people will use their lives as a figure of speech, a standard of blessing because of their huge number. And notice again, he put Ephraim before Manasseh in all of his words. And that he will receive that blessing, the greater blessing. So before I finish this particular scene, I want to notice what the Bible says is important about this. In the book of Hebrews, in the chapter that refers to everyone's great acts of faith, notice it says, by faith, which is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on top of his staff. So out of all of Jacob's life, this scene which we're reading about here is noted as showing Jacob's faith. The verbal blessing of Joseph's sons becoming tribes in the land. That is what he's made in blessing them and showing faith in what God has revealed to him. But then it says he also, as part of his faith, worshipped. And that meaning there is a little bit difficult. We would tend to think where it says worship, it would mean that it was an act of blessing God. And that the act of blessing was, in fact, an act of worship to God. But that wouldn't necessarily show faith. Remember, worship can also mean to bow and to show homage. And there are extra biblical writings that suggest that this act here is not talking about worshiping God, but bowing before Ephraim himself. Acknowledging that Ephraim, in the fullness of nation, will have a king that will come from him. So thus in the physical act, it demonstrates faith. That God said it, it's going to happen, and I'm giving you that respect that you deserve. And that would show faith in God's word. So in the final verses of chapter 48, we read about Jacob's confirmation of the blessing. Verse 21 and 22, it says, then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the land of the Amorites with my sword and my bow. So, in stopping and communicating with Joseph, he reiterates that God will be with you, cause you to succeed in accomplishing his will. And it says, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you, plural, and bring you, plural, back to the land of your, plural, fathers. He's referring to all of them. But then in verse 22, it says, I give you, singular, one portion. So here, when he's talking collectively, we see great faith of returning back to the land, which doesn't happen for another 400 years. But in verse 22, where he says, I give you, specifically Joseph, one portion more than your brothers, he's saying, I'm giving you an additional section of land to you personally. And the portion there can mean slope or portion, and literally it's the word Shechem. And it says, the portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite. What is he talking about? We have no record of this. But actually we do. The Amorite, when he says Amorite, it's singular, and it's a generic term that's used for the inhabitants of Canaan. The Amorites were primarily area of influence was the northern Mesopotamia and Syria. But they had a profound influence on the culture and religious practices in Canaan, especially at that time. So what is Jacob talking about? Remember, he bought some land in the land of Shechem from Shechem's father. And then Levi and Simeon slaughtered all the male inhabitants of Shechem. And so, but here, and that could refer to the sword and the bow. But it said that he bought the portion. And this text is very difficult, and it's been difficult for ages. And there are some Hebrew texts, extra biblical writings, that actually add a story to Jacob's life, telling about this battle, just making it up. But we have more information in the rest of Scriptures. And there's a hermeneutical principle by which we interpret Scripture by other Scripture. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 4, verse 5, it says, "So he," meaning Jesus, "came to the city of Samaria, called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph," referring to a specific. So Shechem is here, Jerusalem and Bethlehem is down here, and Sychar is just ahead or above it. And you see Jacob's well is right below it. So the most likely solution to what happened is that Jacob, when he bought that plot of land from the people of Shechem, from the ruler there, he probably still owed money. It's possible that he didn't pay it all in one lump sum. But then after the slaughter of all the men, well, it was his. And so in essence, he did take it by force. And for this portion, he probably would have some form of proof of purchase they would have with him. Because this land becomes a special plot of land that's specifically given and used for the honor of Joseph. In Joshua chapter 24, it says, "Now they buried the bones of Joseph, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt to Shechem, in the piece of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Haman, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. And they became an inheritance to Joseph's sons." So again, that particular land, why wasn't Joseph buried with the rest of the family, in the family tomb? It was because he gave him that particular portion. So Jacob gives this portion to Joseph out of faith that one day he will indeed return to the land that God had promised him. That covers the chapter of the blessings that were given to Joseph. Now I want to move to main points and applications. Number one, as Jacob recalls, God had blessed him a second time at Luz in Bethel, and shortly after, Rachel died. God's blessings does not remove all pain and suffering in this life. Number two, in Jacob's parting words, we see God's word communicated and emphasized so that the next generation would live in faith according to God's covenant promises. At the end of his life, this was most important for Jacob to pass on. This emphasis demonstrates to us the importance of communicating God's word and covenant promises in the present and throughout our lives. We don't have to wait for our deathbed. Number three, in Jacob's warm embrace of his grandsons and Joseph's words acknowledging that children are a gift from God, we see the important social values towards young men. They are to be valued, loved, included, and given a place. This is what they need as young men trying to find their places. And this is the attitude older men need to have in order to invest in the next generation of their family and our family of faith. Number four, Jacob stops and communicates words of thankfulness and joy for the relationships and life that God has given him. We must not waste the time that we have been given to enjoy with loved ones. Be thankful for the significant blessings of people in your life. Number five, Jacob bears witness of God's blessings and goodness in his life and in the lives of his father and his grandfather. Our personal testimony concerning our walk with God is a unique gift that we have to offer. and must pass on to our children, our grandchildren, and to others. If our greatest treasure is Christ, then we will share him with others. Number 6, it was revealed prophetically to Jacob that Ephraim would be the one who was given the firstborn blessings or greater blessings. In this blessings going to Ephraim, we see that God's blessings are bestowed by his graciousness, by his grace, and choosing alone, and not according to tradition or status. And then finally, number 7, in this passage, Jacob prays for Joseph and his grandsons, asking for God's gracious blessings. Likewise, we can intercede daily for those in our care.